Hold a block of this material in your open hand and you can barely feel that it's there. Up to 99.8% of it is nothing but air. Locked inside a solid you can pick up and squeeze. It stops heat better than anything humans have ever built, and a slice thinner than your finger does the same job as a wall packed with fiberglass. The internet will tell you China just invented it, and that the construction industry is panicking. But China didn't invent this. An American did, back in 1931. And what China is actually doing with it right now is far bigger than that headline. The material is called aerogel, and the first time you see it, your brain refuses to believe the weight. People call it frozen smoke because that's exactly what it looks like. A bluish, hazy ghost of a solid that seems like it should drift off the table. That blue color isn't a dye or a trick, by the way. It's the same physics that makes the sky blue. The pores inside are so small they scatter blue light out of sunlight as it passes through, which is why a block of clear aerogel glows faintly blue against a dark background and turns warm and yellowish when you hold it up to the sun. You can rest a chunk the size of a brick on a single flower and the petals don't bend. And yet, it isn't a gas and it isn't foam. It's a real solid you can machine and cut and stack, and it just happens to be mostly empty space. That combination of properties is so unusual that aerogel racked up around 15 separate Guinness World Records before 2011 alone for things like lowest density solid and best insulator. No other material on that list comes anywhere near that many entries, and the strangest thing about it is that once you actually hold a piece, the numbers stop sounding like exaggeration and start sounding like an understatement. Here's the part that trips people up. That viral number 95% air is actually selling it short. A typical silica aerogel is around 97% air by volume. The record holders are 99.8% air. The solid part, the actual skeleton holding the whole thing together, is a lacework of silica strands so thin they add up to almost nothing. Picture ordinary sand, then imagine puffing it up like popcorn until it's 1,000 times its size and full of holes you'd need a microscope to see. That's aerogel. Puffed up sand, holding its shape on a scaffold of almost pure nothing. The way you get there is genuinely clever. You start with a wet gel, the same basic idea as a jar of jelly, a solid skeleton with liquid filling every gap. The hard part is getting the liquid out. If you just let it dry in the open air, the liquid pulls the fragile skeleton inward as it leaves, and the whole thing shrinks and cracks into a dense little lump. So instead, you cheat physics. You take the liquid to a state where it's neither truly liquid nor truly gas, and in that in-between state, you can coax it out without it ever tugging on the walls. The skeleton stays exactly as it was, now filled with air. That trick is the entire ball game, and figuring it out is the reason one man's name is on the invention. So who made the first one, and why does everyone online think it came out of a Chinese lab last year? The answer goes back almost a century, to a bet over a jar of jelly. In 1931, an American chemist named Samuel Stephens Kistler was arguing with a colleague about jelly. Specifically, whether you could pull the liquid out of a jelly without the whole wobbly structure collapsing into dust. It sounds like a silly question. It wasn't. When liquid evaporates out of any gel, surface tension drags the walls inward as it goes, and the delicate structure caves in on itself. Kistler's insight was that if you could remove the liquid without ever letting it cross that line between liquid and gas, the skeleton might survive untouched. He heated and pressurized the liquid until that line simply vanished, then let it slip away as a gas. What he was left with was the gel's skeleton with all the liquid gone and air in its place. He published it in the journal Nature that same year, in a paper titled Coherent Expanded Aerogels and Jellies. The world's lightest solids had just been born, and they came out of a college lab in California, not a factory in Shenzhen. Then something strange happened. Aerogel got invented, and the world basically ignored it for the next 30 years. The process to make it was slow, wildly expensive, and had a nasty habit of exploding. It needed toxic chemicals and enormous pressure, and the early versions came out cloudy and fragile. Think about what that drying process actually involved. To hit the point where liquid and gas blur into one, you're heating a sealed, pressurized vessel full of solvent to extreme conditions, and if something goes wrong, that vessel becomes a bomb. Early aerogel makers were essentially cooking small explosives to produce a material almost no one had a use for. It was slow, it was dangerous, and each batch came out as a fragile, cloudy little block. This is not a recipe anyone rushes to scale up. NASA, on the other hand, loved the stuff. When weight is everything and you need to survive brutal temperature swings in space, nothing else comes close. They packed aerogel onto Mars rovers to keep the electronics warm through freezing Martian nights, and they famously flew it on a mission to catch dust streaming off a comet, using blocks of aerogel as a soft trap that could grab particles moving faster than a bullet without vaporizing them. For a space agency with a huge budget and an impossible problem, aerogel was perfect. But for anyone building a normal house or wrapping a normal pipe, it stayed a science fiction curiosity. Too pricey, too finicky, too rare. For decades, it was the best insulator nobody could afford. And to understand why the construction world would ever care, you have to understand just how far ahead of everything else this material really is. Insulation works by stopping heat from moving, and heat moves in three ways. It conducts through solid material, it convects as air circulates, and it radiates as invisible waves. Most insulation only fights one or two of those at a time. Fiberglass traps. Pockets of air to slow convection, and that's mostly it. Aerogel fights all three at once, and it does it because of that bizarre internal structure. The pores inside aerogel are so tiny, just a few nanometers wide, that air molecules physically can't bounce around inside them. The air is trapped in spaces smaller than the distance it would normally travel between collisions. Convection stops dead. And because the solid skeleton is so thin and sparse, there's almost no pathway for heat to conduct through either. Heat hits a wall of trapped frozen air and simply gives up. The numbers make it obvious. Thermal conductivity is the measure of how easily heat passes through something, and lower is better. Fiberglass sits around 0.030 to 0.040 watts per meter Kelvin. Aerogel comes in between 0.013 and 0.024. In plain terms, aerogel insulates roughly 2.5 times better than fiberglass for the same thickness. A standard interior wall gives you an R value of about 13 across a full 3.5-inch cavity stuffed with fiberglass. Aerogel hits that same R13 in just 1.25 inches. That's the whole game right there. You get the same warmth, the same energy bill in a third of the space. And it keeps going. Silica aerogel doesn't burn. It melts at around 100 degrees Celsius, which means it's effectively non-combustible, and that matters enormously in tall buildings. A lot of the cheap foam insulation used today is flammable, and after several deadly high-rise fires were made worse by burning cladding and insulation, fire codes in many places now restrict or outright ban foam in mid-rise and high-rise construction. A material that hits a better R value in a thinner layer and simply refuses to catch fire is exactly what those codes are begging for. Then there's water. Most commercial aerogel is hydrophobic, which means it repels water instead of drinking it in. That's a bigger deal than it sounds. Fiberglass that gets wet inside a wall loses much of its insulating value and can rot into a soggy, moldy mess, which is why builders have to add separate vapor barriers to protect it. Aerogel holds its R value even in a damp wall, no barrier required, so stack it all up. Thin, fireproof, waterproof, and outperforming every conventional insulation on the market, packaged into panels as slim as 13 to 15 millimeters or flexible blankets starting around 5 millimeters thin enough to slide into places rigid foam board could never fit. On paper, this should have replaced everything decades ago. So why is it wrapped around industrial pipes and packed into space probes, but almost certainly nowhere in the house you're sitting in right now? One reason: money. And this is exactly where China walks into the story. For 90 years, aerogel had one fatal flaw as a building material, and it came down to cost. Making the stuff was punishingly expensive. That supercritical drying process Kistler pioneered needs high-pressure vessels, careful handling, and a lot of energy and solvent for every batch. For most of the material's life, it cost far too much per square meter to ever compete with a cheap roll of fiberglass at the hardware store. The construction industry didn't panic about aerogel because the price tag did all the panicking for them. It kept the miracle material safely locked up in aerospace and heavy industry, where clients could afford it. Then, starting around 2014, something shifted. More than 20 serious aerogel manufacturers sprang up across China in just a few years, almost all of them founded within that narrow window. Companies like Nanotech, Guangdong Allison High-Tech, and a fast-rising newcomer called Invention began doing to aerogel what Chinese industry has done to solar panels, to batteries, and to electric cars. They scaled it. They took a boutique laboratory process and turned it into industrial mass production, driving the cost per unit down year after year. Guangdong Allison alone expanded its production capacity by 44% in a single year to keep up with demand. A big part of the breakthrough was swapping out the process itself. Instead of the dangerous solvent-heavy drying Kistler used, a lot of Chinese producers moved to supercritical carbon dioxide drying, which is safer, faster, and easier to run at industrial scale. One of the leaders here is Guizhou Aerospace Wujiang, a company under China's state aerospace and defense giant CATL. It holds around 20% of the domestic aerogel market and is the largest Chinese operation mass-producing aerogel with supercritical carbon dioxide equipment it designs and builds itself. When your national aerospace conglomerate is building the machines that make your insulation, you are no longer running a boutique lab process. And it worked so well that the established Western leader, Aspen Aerogels in the United States, went to court, filing lawsuits against Chinese manufacturers including Nanotech and Guangdong Allison in North America and Europe over patents. But here's the catch for Aspen. Many of those key early patents are aging out and starting to expire, and once the patent wall comes down, there's very little to stop the Chinese cost advantage from spreading worldwide. When the market leader starts suing the newcomers, that's usually a sign the newcomers are winning. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do, take a second to subscribe, because this channel digs into exactly this kind of story, the breakthroughs and the industrial shifts coming out of China that quietly reshape entire global industries. Now here's the twist that makes the whole aerogel story click into place. Because what funded China's aerogel takeover had almost nothing to do with buildings. The money came from electric cars, and once you see that connection, the whole story clicks into place. Think about what happens inside an electric vehicle battery when things go wrong. Lithium-ion cells are packed together tightly, and if one cell fails, it can overheat in seconds and set off what engineers call thermal runaway. A single failing cell can rocket past 150 degrees Celsius almost instantly and start venting hot, flammable gas. The heat jumps to the next cell, then the next, and the whole pack can catch fire in a chain reaction that's nearly impossible to stop once it starts. Researchers at Tsinghua University, one of China's top engineering schools, have spent years mapping exactly how this cascade unfolds, and the conclusion they keep landing on is simple. If you can physically block the heat from jumping between cells, you can stop the whole disaster before it spreads. The single best way to do that is a thin, fireproof barrier slipped between the cells that refuses to let heat cross from one to another. And it turns out the perfect material for that barrier is a thin sheet of silica aerogel. It's fireproof, it's astonishingly good at blocking heat, and here's the crucial part. It's thin. Regular insulation thick enough to stop that heat would eat 15 to 20% of the pack's energy density, stealing range the car maker can't spare. Aerogel pads do the same job at 0.5 millimeter to 3 millimeters thick, which makes them the thinnest effective option anyone has found. China happens to build the overwhelming majority of the world's electric vehicle batteries. In 2020, the country introduced a mandatory national safety standard known as GB 38031 that forced battery packs to survive exactly this kind of thermal propagation test. Suddenly, every major Chinese battery maker needed a thin, reliable fire barrier, and they needed it by the millions. Aerogel pads, some as thin as 0.5 millimeter to 3 millimeters, became standard equipment inside battery packs from the biggest names in the business, including CATL, BYD, and Xiaomi. With global electric vehicle production now running past 30 million units a year, that's an ocean of demand for a material that used to be a lab curiosity. That demand is what paid for everything. The battery market gave Chinese aerogel factories a reason to build enormous production capacity, and enormous production capacity is exactly what drives the cost down for everyone else. China's silica aerogel market hit 2.173 billion yuan in 2023, growing 19% in a single year, and it's projected to blow past 4 billion yuan. The car battery was the Trojan horse. It got the factories built, and now that same cheap mass-produced aerogel is looking around for its next market, which brings the whole story right back to your walls. And the timing there is not an accident either. China has committed to what it calls its dual carbon goals, a national push to peak carbon emissions and then reach carbon neutrality, and buildings are a huge slice of that problem. Heating and cooling leaky buildings burns an enormous amount of energy, so the government has been tightening building energy codes and pushing architects towards slim, high-performance wall assemblies, which is precisely where aerogel shines. You can hit a demanding insulation target without making the walls thick and clumsy. Chinese Industry Association forecasts already put demand for aerogel in building insulation alone at around 2 billion yuan, and that's before the price fully collapses. Aerogel panels only 13 to 15 millimeters thick can go exactly where a fat slab of foam board never could, which makes them ideal for renovating older buildings that have no room to spare inside the walls. The construction industry isn't panicking yet, but if you're selling thick rolls of ordinary insulation, you probably should be watching this very closely. And in 2026, that cost collapse hit a new milestone that shows exactly where this is heading. Researchers at Nanjing Tech University unveiled a new generation of aerogel battery firewall, and the numbers are genuinely startling. Earlier aerogel barriers could handle roughly 650 degrees Celsius before losing their grip, which was a problem because a burning battery cell can hit temperatures far higher than that. The new material pushes that ceiling all the way up to 1,300 degrees Celsius. In testing, a sheet just 2.3 millimeters thick was blasted with 1,000 degree heat on one side for 5 straight minutes, and the far side stayed below 100 degrees Celsius. It could hold that thermal wall for up to 2 hours, buying an enormous window for people to get clear of a failing pack. But the part that matters for your house is buried in how they made it. The team refined the supercritical drying process, the same expensive step that held aerogel back for 90 years, and pushed their solvent recovery so high that they were reusing more than 99.5% of the ethanol. That one improvement cut the raw material cost by more than half and moved the material from lab bench to industrial production. That's the real headline right there. The firewall got better, and the recipe for making it got dramatically cheaper. Every time China solves the cost problem for its battery industry, it accidentally solves the cost problem for construction too. The gap between miracle material and affordable building product is closing fast, and the thing closing it is the electric car sitting in the driveway. So the viral post had it backwards in almost every detail, and yet somehow landed on something true. China didn't invent aerogel. The 95% air figure is actually low, the real number is closer to 99. And the construction industry isn't exactly panicking. But strip away the clickbait, and the real story is arguably wilder. A 90-year-old American invention, ignored for decades because it was too expensive, has been dragged into mass production by an industry that only wanted to stop car batteries from burning, and the side effect is that the single best insulating material ever discovered is finally getting cheap enough to wrap a building in. That's not panic. That's a slow-motion revolution in what a wall can be, and China is already chasing the next extreme. For years, scientists around the world had been trading the title of lightest solid material back and forth. A carbon nanotube foam held it at 4 milligrams per cubic centimeter. Then a metal microlattice took it down to 0.9. Then a German team's material called aerographite grabbed it at around 0.18. Each one was a serious lab achievement. And then in 2013, at Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, a research team led by Gao Chao blew past all of them. They built a version of aerogel out of graphene and carbon, freeze-drying it into a structure so empty it barely registers on a scale. It's called aerographene, and it took the crown at 0.16 milligrams per cubic centimeter. To put that in perspective, that's a sixth the density of air itself. This is a solid object, one you can hold and shape, that weighs less than the air it displaces. Set a piece the size of a mug on top of a blade of grass, and the grass doesn't bend. Guinness World Records made it official, and the record still stands today. But the part Gao was most excited about wasn't the record. It was that the material was easy to make and could be produced at the scale of full cubic meters, not tiny lab samples. It's spongy and elastic, and it can soak up huge amounts of oil, which is why the team pointed to ocean oil spills as an early target. Pour it over a spill, let it drink up the oil, then squeeze the oil back out and reuse the sponge. On top of that, aerographene works as an energy storage material and a heat insulator, tying it right back to everything we just talked about. That's the frontier this material is racing toward. A solid that's lighter than air, that cleans up oil spills, that could reshape everything from insulation to energy storage. It started with a bet about jelly in 1931, and it's ended up as one of the strangest, most useful materials on the planet, with China now holding the factories that decide how cheap it gets. But aerogel is only one way the walls around us are starting to turn into something new. Because there's another Chinese breakthrough that does something even stranger to a building. It turns the concrete of the structure itself into a giant battery, storing energy in the very walls and columns holding the roof up. That's the video playing on screen right now, and it might be the strangest one yet.